The morning of February 24th, 1943, a small landing craft approached the eastern shore of the Russell Islands through choppy seas. Lieutenant Commander Robert Painter stood at the bow, scanning the dense jungle canopy that rose directly from the waterline. Behind him, 387 men of the 43rd Naval Construction Battalion prepared to disembark. Their orders were unprecedented in military history. Establish an operational fighter strip capable of launching Marine Corsairs within 72 hours of landing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Japanese garrison on nearby New Georgia, just 40 miles distant, maintained constant aerial reconnaissance over these waters. Enemy commanders calculated that any American attempt to establish air bases in the Russell Islands would require months of preparation, thousands of laborers, and extensive supply lines. Their intelligence assessments, later captured and translated by Allied interrogation translation services, estimated a minimum of 12 weeks from initial landing to first operational sortie. They had 72 hours to prove every Japanese calculation catastrophically wrong. As the landing craft grounded on the coral beach, Painter checked his watch. It was 06:15 hours. The clock had started. What happened over the next 3 days would fundamentally alter Japanese defensive strategy across the entire Pacific theater and accelerate the island-hopping campaign by months, perhaps years. But the story of how American construction battalions achieved the impossible in 72 hours begins not on a distant Pacific island, but in the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor 15 months earlier. December 7th, 1941 shattered more than battleships and aircraft. It exposed a critical vulnerability in American Pacific strategy that military planners had somehow overlooked. When Japanese forces struck Pearl Harbor, they simultaneously attacked Wake Island, where over 1,200 American civilian contractors were constructing military facilities. These men, recruited from construction companies across the United States, possessed exactly the skills needed for rapid base construction. But under international law, civilians could not bear arms in combat. Those who resisted military attack faced execution as unlawful combatants. 98 of these civilian workers were murdered by Japanese forces after Wake Island's surrender, their deaths highlighting a problem that Admiral Ben Morrell, Chief of the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks, understood with perfect clarity. Modern warfare in the Pacific would require construction of hundreds of bases across thousands of islands. Civilian contractors could neither defend themselves nor be legally defended. The solution was radical: militarize construction itself. On December 28, 1941, just 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Morrell formally requested authorization to create military construction units composed of men recruited directly from the construction trades. The proposal violated conventional military thinking. Standard recruitment focused on young men who could be trained from scratch. Morrell wanted older men, experienced professionals who already knew their trades. He wanted carpenters who had built skyscrapers, equipment operators who had moved mountains for dam projects, engineers who had designed bridges. He wanted to draft American industry itself and deploy it with rifles. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By January 5, 1942, authorization was granted. The recruitment specifications were unlike anything in American military history. Men aged 18 to 50 were eligible, with exceptions made for older specialists with critical skills. Some men in their 60s who possessed unique expertise managed to enlist by lying about their ages. The average recruit was 37 years old, nearly twice the age of typical military enlistees. These were men who had survived the Great Depression by building America's infrastructure. Now they would build the infrastructure of victory. The force was designated Naval Construction Battalions, quickly abbreviated to the initials C and B, which sailors and Marines phonetically rendered as Seabees. The name stuck, and with it emerged a force that would prove as decisive to Pacific victory as any aircraft carrier or bomber squadron. The 1st Battalions, formed in early 1942, underwent abbreviated training that emphasized military discipline and weapons handling while assuming construction expertise already existed. Standard boot camp lasted 12 weeks. Seabee training lasted 4 weeks. The assumption was simple. These men already knew how to build. They just needed to learn how to fight. The urgency was driven by crisis. By mid-1942, Japanese forces controlled a vast defensive perimeter stretching from the Aleutian Islands to New Guinea. Every week of delay allowed them to fortify these positions further. American strategists understood that offensive operations would require advanced bases, but conventional military engineering timelines measured construction in months and years. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, needed something faster. He needed bases operational within days of capture, not months. He needed construction that proceeded at combat speed. The first test came at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides Islands during July 1942. A small detachment from the 1st Construction Battalion arrived with minimal equipment. 6 tractors, 2 scrapers, 1 grease truck, 1 gasoline wagon, 3 weapons carriers, and a single 50-kilowatt generator. Intelligence reported that Japanese forces were completing an airfield on Guadalcanal, just 630 miles distant. Allied commanders desperately needed a base from which to launch attacks before Japanese bombers could threaten the sea lanes to Australia. The Seabees were given 20 days to construct a 6,000-foot runway through virgin jungle. The terrain was brutally hostile. Trees rose 150 feet, their massive roots penetrating deep into coral substrate. Swamps covered low-lying areas. The jungle was so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. Rain fell almost continuously, turning cleared areas into seas of mud. Under conventional military engineering doctrine, such a project would require surveying teams working for weeks, followed by months of gradual clearing and construction. The Seabees worked around the clock in continuous shifts. They felled giant trees with chainsaws and dynamited the roots from coral foundations. They drained swamps by hand-digging drainage channels. They used their limited number of bulldozers 20 hours per day, with 4 hours reserved for maintenance and repairs. When tractors broke down, mechanics worked through the night by flashlight to restore them to operation. On July 28, 1942, exactly 20 days after work began, the 1st Marine Fighter Squadron landed on the completed runway. The next morning, B-17 Flying Fortresses arrived. The race for Guadalcanal had been won before Marines even stormed the beaches. Lieutenant Commander Yasumi Doi of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 11th Air Fleet wrote in a report discovered in captured archives after the war that enemy construction capabilities exceeded all pre-war estimates by factors Japanese military planners could not reconcile with known engineering principles. Japanese intelligence had calculated that establishing air operations from Espiritu Santo would require 3 months minimum. When American bombers appeared after 3 weeks, Japanese commanders initially assumed they were carrier-based aircraft. The possibility that land-based bombers could be operating from a fully functional airfield built in 20 days simply did not fit within Japanese military doctrine. The Japanese had excellent reasons for their disbelief. Their own airfield construction on Guadalcanal had required 2,774 workers, labouring for 4 months to build a single unpaved runway. The project utilised forced labour from Korea and Formosa, with workers dying daily from exhaustion, disease, and malnutrition. Even after months of work, the Japanese runway remained unpaved, turned to mud during heavy rains, and lacked proper drainage. Japanese construction relied almost entirely on manual labour, with individual workers carrying baskets of dirt and stones. Against such methods, American mechanized construction appeared impossible. But the 20-day construction at Espiritu Santo, impressive as it was, represented just the beginning. The real revolution in construction speed came from innovations that would reduce that timeline from 20 days to 72 hours. The breakthrough came from 3 interconnected developments: Marston matting, coral crushing techniques, and refined operational procedures that transformed construction from a sequential process into a parallel operation where multiple tasks proceeded simultaneously. Marston matting, also called pierced steel planking, revolutionized airfield construction more than any single technology of the war. Developed at the Army's Waterways Experiment Station in Vicksburg, Mississippi, each section measured 10 feet long by 15 inches wide and weighed 66 pounds. The planking contained 87 holes that allowed drainage and prevented mud accumulation. Sections interlocked through a hook and loop system that created a continuous surface strong enough to support fully loaded bombers. A single construction battalion could lay 2,000 feet of runway per day using this material. The contrast with Japanese construction methods was absolute. Japanese engineers built runways by hand-placing individual stones, then laboriously tamping them into place with manual equipment. A Japanese construction unit required weeks to create what Seabees accomplished in an afternoon using Marston matting. More critically, matting could be laid over almost any surface. Rough coral, compacted dirt, even swampy ground could be transformed into operational runways within hours once the surface was roughly leveled. The second innovation involved coral itself. The Pacific Islands were largely composed of coral formations that traditional engineering wisdom considered hostile to construction. Coral was sharp, irregular, and seemed impossibly difficult to work with using conventional methods. Seabee engineers discovered that crushed coral, when properly compacted, created a surface nearly as hard as concrete. Mobile crushing plants could process coral at 100 tons per hour, producing runway material on site. Japanese equipment, when it existed at all, managed perhaps 5 tons per day. The crushing process worked because coral possessed unique properties. When broken into small pieces and rolled with heavy equipment, the fragments interlocked and compressed into an extremely stable base. Water drainage through crushed coral was excellent, preventing the mud problems that plagued Japanese unpaved runways. Most importantly, coral was abundant on virtually every Pacific island, eliminating the need to transport massive quantities of fill material across thousands of miles of ocean. The third element was procedural. Seabee commanders developed construction sequences that allowed multiple operations to proceed in parallel rather than waiting for each phase to complete before starting the next. Traditional engineering called for complete surveying before any clearing, complete clearing before any grading, complete grading before any surfacing. Seabees surveyed, cleared, graded, and surfaced simultaneously across different sections of the runway. Bulldozers cleared jungle at one end while graders leveled the surface in the middle and matting crews worked at the far end. The construction site became a continuous assembly line, where completed runway emerged from one end while virgin jungle disappeared into the other. These innovations converged at the Russell Islands in February 1943, where the 72-hour construction standard was first achieved under combat conditions. The 43rd Naval Construction Battalion that landed on February 24th faced challenges that exceeded those at Espiritu Santo. Japanese air reconnaissance from nearby New Georgia meant construction would proceed under constant threat of air attack. The jungle was denser, the coral substrate was harder, and the timeline was 1/7 as long. Commander Robert Painter had planned the operation with meticulous detail during the voyage to the Russell Islands. His battalion would land with the first assault waves immediately behind Marine infantry. Bulldozers would be offloaded first, followed by graders, then rollers. Coral crushing equipment would be established within hours of landing. Marston matting, pre-loaded on specialized landing craft, would be positioned for immediate use. Every man knew his specific assignment. Every piece of equipment had a designated role. Nothing was left to improvisation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. At 06:30 hours on February 24th, the first bulldozers roared off landing craft directly onto the beach. By 0700 hours, they were cutting into the jungle. The noise was tremendous. Diesel engines roared at maximum power as bulldozers pushed into massive trees. Chainsaws screamed as cutting crews felled trees that bulldozers could not simply push over. Dynamite charges detonated every few minutes as engineers blasted tree roots from coral foundations. To marine infantrymen securing the perimeter, it seemed less like military construction and more like industrial warfare against the jungle itself. Japanese aerial reconnaissance photographed the construction site at noon on the first day. Intelligence analysts on New Georgia studied the images with confusion. The cleared area seemed impossibly large for just 6 hours of work. They calculated that at the observed rate of clearing, the Americans would have a runway operational within days, not weeks or months. The report was forwarded to higher headquarters with a note indicating possible misidentification of construction activity for something else. The speed simply seemed impossible. By 1800 hours on the first day, over 800 feet of jungle had been completely cleared to a width of 200 feet. Coral crushing operations had begun, with mobile crushers processing coral blasted from the runway path. Grading equipment followed immediately behind the bulldozers, creating a rough level surface. The construction proceeded without pause through the night, with portable floodlights illuminating the worksite. The lights drew occasional sniper fire from Japanese stragglers in the jungle, but marine security teams suppressed these threats while construction continued without interruption. The second day brought the most intensive phase of construction. By 0600 hours on February 25th, over half the runway length had been cleared and roughly graded. Roller equipment began compacting crushed coral into the prepared surface. The compaction required multiple passes with increasingly heavy rollers. Light rollers made the first passes to avoid breaking through the surface. Medium rollers followed to increase density. Finally, heavy 10-ton rollers made final passes to create a surface hard enough to support aircraft weighing 20,000 pounds fully loaded. Behind the rollers, matting crews worked with assembly line precision. Each section of Marston matting was carried by 2 men who positioned it precisely to interlock with previously laid sections. Specialized hooking crews followed immediately behind, using crowbars to ensure each connection was secure. A good crew could lay 100 feet of matting per hour. Painter had 6 crews working simultaneously, creating 600 feet of completed runway every hour. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese reconnaissance flights on the second day photographed a construction site that now defied all engineering logic. Over 3,000 feet of runway appeared to be approaching completion. The cleared area extended the full length of what would obviously become a major airfield. Equipment that Japanese observers could not identify was operating across the entire site. The reconnaissance report noted with undisguised amazement that construction appeared to be proceeding faster than Japanese engineers could repair bomb damage to existing facilities on New Georgia. By 1800 hours on February 25th, 42 hours after landing, over 4,000 feet of runway had been completed to full operational standard. The coral base was compacted to a density exceeding concrete. Marston matting covered the entire surface, providing a level, stable platform capable of supporting the heaviest aircraft. Drainage ditches flanked both sides of the runway, ensuring water would not accumulate on the surface. Basic facilities, including a control tower constructed from prefabricated sections and fuel dumps protected by sandbag revetments, were in place. Painter inspected the runway personally at dusk on the second day, walking its entire length while checking for any irregularities in the matting or soft spots in the base. He found none. The construction quality met or exceeded standards for permanent installations built at established bases. The difference was that this runway had been built in less than 2 days in hostile territory, while under threat of enemy air attack. At 2000 hours, he radioed Marine headquarters that the airfield would be operational at dawn on February 26th. The final 12 hours involved finishing work that could proceed in parallel with flight operations. Taxiways connecting the runway to dispersal areas were completed. Additional fuel storage was established. Ammunition dumps for aircraft ordnance were prepared. Repair facilities, including prefabricated maintenance shelters, were erected. By 0600 hours on February 26th, exactly 72 hours after the first bulldozer rolled off the landing craft, Marine Major John Smith approached in his F-4U Corsair fighter. Smith had received orders to conduct a test landing to verify the runway's operational status. He expected to make a single pass, land carefully to test the surface, then take off again. Instead, he found himself looking down at what appeared to be a fully functional airfield that could have been operating for months. The runway stretched 6,000 feet, longer than many permanent installations. The matting surface showed no irregularities. Taxiways led to dispersal areas where ground crews were already waiting. He touched down at 06:15 hours, the Corsair's main landing gear making first contact with the matting precisely 72 hours and 0 minutes after construction began. The landing was smooth. The matting held firm under the Corsair's 8-ton weight. Smith taxied to the dispersal area where ground crews immediately began refueling and rearming his aircraft. 30 minutes later, he took off again, this time leading a flight of 12 Corsairs that would establish permanent station at the Russell Islands. By noon on February 26th, 40 Marine aircraft were operating from the field. By evening, the first airstrikes against Japanese positions on New Georgia were launched from the newly completed base. Japanese commanders on New Georgia received reports of the operational American airfield with frank disbelief. Staff officers insisted the reports must be errors. Perhaps the Americans had simply repaired a previously existing facility. Perhaps reconnaissance had misidentified the island. A major airfield could not possibly be constructed in 3 days. It violated every principle of military engineering that Japanese officers had learned. Their own construction experiences, their training, their doctrine, all insisted that the reports had to be wrong. But the reports were correct, and the implications were devastating. Colonel Genjiro Tanaka, commanding Japanese forces on New Georgia, understood immediately what the 72-hour construction meant for Japanese defensive strategy. If Americans could build operational airfields in 3 days, then every island in the Pacific could become an American airbase within a week of capture. The carefully planned defensive perimeter that was supposed to exhaust American forces through lengthy sieges would be systematically bypassed. Each American advance would create new bases that supported the next advance. The defensive timeline calculations that underpinned all Japanese strategic planning had just been proven catastrophically wrong. The 72-hour standard established at the Russell Islands became operational doctrine for Pacific construction. What had seemed impossible in early 1943 became routine by mid-year. At Rendover Island in June 1943, the 24th Naval Construction Battalion built a fighter strip in 60 hours. At Vella La Vella in August, the 58th Battalion completed a field in 78 hours on terrain Japanese engineers had declared unbuildable swampland. Each construction project refined techniques and reduced timelines further. The impact on the island-hopping campaign was profound and immediate. Admiral William Halsey's advance through the Solomon Islands accelerated dramatically once 72-hour airfield construction became reliable. Previous planning had assumed weeks or months between major operations to establish supporting bases. Now, operations could proceed continuously, with each captured island becoming operational before Japanese forces could effectively respond. The tempo of advance increased from months between objectives to weeks, then to days. At Bougainville in November 1943, the integration of rapid construction with offensive strategy reached maturity. Marine forces landed on November 1st and secured a small beachhead at Torokina. Multiple construction battalions landed with the assault waves. The 25th, 53rd, 71st, and 75th construction battalions worked simultaneously on different sections of what would become 2 major airfields. The Torokina fighter strip was operational December 10th, just 39 days after landing. The bomber strip at Piva was completed December 30th. Japanese forces on Bougainville, numbering over 40,000 troops in fortified positions, watched in growing horror as American airfields materialized faster than defensive positions could be prepared. Japanese commanders had calculated they would have months to prepare defenses while Americans slowly built supporting infrastructure. Instead, American bombers were striking Japanese positions from newly built bases before Japanese engineers had finished surveying potential defensive lines. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese soldiers reported feeling that they were fighting, not just an enemy army, but an enemy civilization that could reshape reality itself. The construction techniques employed at Bougainville demonstrated how far Seabee capabilities had advanced in just 18 months. Instead of waiting to completely clear an area before beginning construction, bulldozers worked in echelon formations. Lead bulldozers cleared initial paths through the jungle. Following bulldozers widened these paths into roads. Subsequent bulldozers shaped the terrain for runways. Behind them, coral crushers, graders, and rollers worked in continuous sequence. Matting crews followed immediately, creating completed runway even while jungle still stood at the far end of the construction site. The innovation of armored bulldozers first appeared at Bougainville. Japanese snipers and artillery specifically targeted equipment operators, recognizing that destroying a bulldozer halted far more work than killing individual soldiers. Seabee units responded by welding steel plates to bulldozer cabs, creating improvised armor that protected operators from small arms fire and shrapnel. These armored bulldozers continued working under fire that would have halted conventional construction. Operators sometimes sustained minor wounds but remained at their positions, understanding that stopping meant delays that could cost Marine lives in the front lines. The most dramatic demonstration of construction supporting island-hopping strategy came during the Gilbert Islands campaign in November 1943. At Tarawa, the 7th 4th Naval Construction Battalion landed with Marine assault forces on November 20th. The fighting was among the most intense of the Pacific War. Japanese defenders had transformed the tiny island into a fortress. Over 5,000 Japanese troops occupied positions that had been fortified for months. The battle lasted 76 hours of close-quarters combat that resulted in over 3,000 American casualties. The airfield on Batio Island had been built by Japanese forces over several months, using primarily manual labor. The runway was damaged during the pre-invasion bombardment and further damaged during the fighting. Marines captured the field on November 23rd. The Seabees had it fully operational 15 hours later. This timeline was not an estimate or propaganda figure. It was documented in official Naval Construction Battalion action reports with precise timestamps. At 0600 hours on November 24th, the first Marine aircraft landed on a runway that 76 hours earlier had been the center of one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. Japanese military intelligence officers studying reports of Tarawa's rapid reconstruction faced a crisis in understanding. Their own engineering timelines indicated that repairing a battle-damaged runway should require weeks. Clearing debris, filling craters from bombs and shells, repairing drainage systems, and restoring the surface to operational condition involved extensive work. Yet Americans had accomplished this in less than a day. The reports seemed so implausible that some Japanese staff officers suggested they must be American propaganda designed to create false impressions of construction capability. But the reports were accurate, and they kept coming. At Makin Atoll, also in the Gilbert Islands, the 102nd Construction Battalion landed on November 21st and had the airfield operational by November 24th. At Apamama Atoll, a small detachment from the 102nd Battalion built an entirely new fighter strip in 8 days on an island that Japanese planners had considered too small for airfield construction. Each success compressed the timeline further and accelerated the pace of American advance. The techniques that enabled 15-hour airfield rehabilitation at Tarawa reflected accumulated experience from dozens of previous construction projects. Seabees developed standardized procedures for damage assessment that could be completed in under 2 hours. Teams surveyed the runway systematically, categorizing damage into standard types with predetermined repair procedures. Crater filling utilized crushed coral mixed with aviation gasoline, which, when compacted and ignited, created a surface as hard as the original coral base. Mast and matting could be laid directly over repaired sections, creating immediate operational capability even while permanent repairs continued. The procedures were so refined that construction proceeded with industrial precision under combat conditions. Teams worked in shifts around the clock. Equipment operators were rotated every 4 hours to maintain maximum alertness. Maintenance crews kept equipment operational through preventive maintenance that anticipated failures before they occurred. Supply systems ensured that materials were always available at the point of construction. The entire process resembled a factory assembly line more than military engineering. By early 1944, Japanese military planning had been forced to acknowledge that American construction capabilities fundamentally altered strategic possibilities. Intelligence estimates captured after the war show Japanese staff officers calculating that American forces could establish air superiority over any captured territory within 72 hours, rather than weeks or months. This recognition invalidated defensive strategies based on fighting for time. If Americans could build operational bases faster than Japanese forces could relocate between threatened points, then the entire concept of elastic defense collapsed. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, admitted in post-war interrogations that Japanese defensive planning had been predicated on assumptions about construction timelines that proved completely wrong. Japanese forces had expected to trade space for time, falling back to refland of coastal life, in successive defensive positions, while Americans slowly built up logistics for the next advance. Instead, Americans advanced continuously, with each captured island becoming operational before Japanese forces completed their withdrawal to the next defensive line. The tempo of operations exceeded anything Japanese planning had contemplated. The Marshall Islands campaign in February 1944 demonstrated mature island-hopping strategy enabled by rapid construction. American forces bypassed heavily fortified Japanese positions and struck directly at less defended islands suitable for airfield construction. At Majuro Atoll, seized without opposition on January 31st, the 57th Construction Battalion built a complete aviation complex, including a bomber strip, fighter strips, seaplane facilities, and comprehensive support infrastructure in under 6 weeks. At Kwajalein, the 83rd and 121st Construction Battalions transformed captured Japanese facilities into a major American base, while combat operations still continued on other parts of the atoll. The most significant achievement came at Eniwetok in February 1944. The island was seized after fierce fighting between February 17th and 21st. Construction battalions landed with assault forces and began airfield construction, while Marines still fought Japanese defenders at the far end of the island. The timeline compressed beyond previous records. Within 48 hours of the island being declared secure, the first American aircraft landed. Within a week, Eniwetok was supporting major air operations against Japanese positions in the Caroline Islands, bypassing and neutralizing the major Japanese base at Truk. The bypassing strategy worked only because rapid construction enabled each captured island to immediately support subsequent operations. If airfield construction required weeks or months, bypassed Japanese bases could interfere with supply lines and threaten construction projects. But 72-hour construction meant that newly captured islands became operational faster than Japanese forces could mount effective counterattacks. By the time Japanese commanders recognized the threat and assembled forces for counterattack, American airfields were already operational and protected by air superiority. The Marianas Campaign in summer 1944 brought Seabee construction capabilities to their absolute peak and demonstrated how 72-hour airfield construction enabled strategic bombing of the Japanese homeland. On Saipan, the 121st Naval Construction Battalion landed with assault forces on June 15th. Japanese defenders still held positions overlooking Aslito Airfield. Under constant enemy fire, with Japanese tanks counterattacking across the runway itself, Seabees began repairs within hours of the Marine landing. The construction proceeded under conditions that would have halted conventional military engineering. Japanese artillery had pre-registered coordinates for the entire airfield complex. Mortar rounds fell continuously on the runway. Snipers targeted equipment operators. Japanese infantry launched counterattacks designed specifically to disrupt construction. Yet the work never stopped. When operators were wounded, replacements immediately took their positions. When equipment was damaged by enemy fire, mechanics repaired it under fire. When craters appeared from artillery strikes, they were filled within hours. 4 days after the initial landing, on June 19th, Aslito Airfield was fully operational. P-47 Thunderbolt fighters began providing close air support to Marines still fighting less than 2 miles away. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was profound. They watched American aircraft taking off from a runway that Japanese engineers had spent months building and that Japanese forces had fought desperately to defend. Within days of losing the position, it was supporting attacks against their own forces. The speed of the transition from Japanese to American operational control seemed to violate natural law. Colonel Takeshi Takashina, commanding the Japanese 43rd Division on Saipan, understood the implications immediately. In messages intercepted and decrypted by American intelligence, he warned higher headquarters that American construction capabilities meant every lost position immediately became a base for further American advances. Japanese forces could not trade space for time because Americans converted space into combat power faster than Japanese forces could withdraw to new positions. The fundamental calculus of defensive warfare had been altered. On Guam, the pattern repeated with even greater speed. The 25th and 53rd Construction Battalions landed with assault forces on July 21, 1944. Orote Airfield, badly damaged by pre-invasion bombardment and further damaged during the fighting, was operational within 1 week. Japanese forces had held Guam for 30 months following its capture in December 1941. During that entire period, Japanese engineers had never managed to extend the runway beyond 4,500 feet. Seabees extended it to 6,000 feet in 10 days, while combat operations continued across the island. The construction techniques employed on Guam demonstrated innovations that further reduced timelines. Prefabricated control tower sections arrived on specialized landing craft and were assembled in under 12 hours. Fuel storage bladders, massive rubber tanks that could hold thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline, were installed and operational within 24 hours. Ammunition storage facilities using standardized designs were constructed in parallel with runway work. The entire airfield complex came together not as a series of sequential projects, but as a synchronized operation where every element reached completion simultaneously. But Tinian represented the ultimate demonstration of how rapid construction enabled strategic operations. After the island's capture in late July 1944, the 6th Naval Construction Brigade received orders that seemed to defy possibility. Transform Tinian into the world's largest bomber base complex, capable of supporting the B-29 Superfortress strategic bombing campaign against Japan. Complete the essential elements within 90 days. The scope was staggering. 6 runways, each 8,500 feet long and 200 feet wide. Hard stands for 265 B-29 bombers. Fuel storage for 16 million gallons of aviation gasoline. Bomb storage for 30,000 tons of ordnance. Housing and support facilities for 50,000 personnel. Japanese forces had occupied Tinian for decades. Their engineers had declared large-scale construction impossible due to the terrain. The island was covered in dense jungle, riddled with caves, and composed largely of sharp coral that destroyed conventional equipment. Thousands of Japanese defenders still hid in caves, emerging at night to attack construction crews. The highest point was only 545 feet above sea level, but the terrain was brutally difficult. Yet Seabees completed the essential construction elements in 67 days, working 24 hours per day in 3 shifts. The statistics alone seemed impossible. 15,000 Seabees moved 11 million cubic yards of coral and earth, equivalent to digging a canal 10 feet deep, 50 feet wide, and 830 miles long. They paved runways with 900,000 square yards of asphalt produced on site using portable asphalt plants. They laid 20 miles of taxiways. They erected 1,200 Quonset huts, each assembled in hours from prefabricated sections. They built 6 miles of warehouses and workshops capable of complete aircraft overhauls. They constructed the largest aircraft maintenance facility in the Pacific Theater. The techniques employed were revolutionary. Instead of clearing jungle by hand, Seabees chained bulldozers together and drove through in formation, clearing hundreds of acres per day. Multiple D8 bulldozers, each generating 148 horsepower, were connected by heavy chains stretched between them. The formation advanced into virgin jungle like a mechanical scythe, toppling trees and dragging them aside. Behind the initial clearing, following bulldozers pushed the debris into massive piles for burning. The clearing rate reached 50 acres per day, a figure that Japanese engineers would have considered impossible even with unlimited manual labor. Coral blasting utilized shaped charges that fragmented coral formations with maximum efficiency. Engineers calculated precise charge placements that broke coral into optimal sizes for crushing. Mobile crushing plants operated continuously, processing coral into aggregate at rates that turned the island's natural geology into runway material faster than traditional quarrying could extract stone from mountains. The crushed coral was transported by fleets of trucks that operated in continuous relays. Empty trucks returning from the runway site passed loaded trucks, heading toward it in an endless cycle that continued without pause. The compaction equipment employed represented the most advanced available. 10-ton and 15-ton rollers, far heavier than anything Japanese forces possessed, compressed the coral base to densities approaching concrete. Multiple passes with increasingly heavy equipment created surfaces capable of supporting B-29 bombers weighing 70 tons when fully loaded with fuel and bombs. The engineering tolerances were exact. Runway surfaces had to be level within fractions of an inch across thousands of feet. Drainage had to be perfect to prevent water accumulation. The surface hardness had to be sufficient to withstand repeated takeoffs and landings by the heaviest aircraft in the American inventory. By October 12, 1944, less than 3 months after the island's capture, the first B-29 Superfortress landed on Tinian. The aircraft, named Joltin Josie, touched down on Northfield's newly completed 8,500-foot runway. The landing marked a strategic turning point in the Pacific War. Japan's home islands were now within range of sustained heavy bomber attacks launched from bases that had been built faster than Japanese strategic planning had considered possible. Every calculation about defensive timelines, every assumption about how long Japan could hold out, had been invalidated by construction that proceeded at speeds that seemed to mock traditional engineering. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and was now analyzing American capabilities for Japanese naval intelligence, wrote in September 1944 that enemy construction abilities rendered defensive calculations meaningless. Americans did not capture and improve Japanese bases. They created superior facilities from nothing in less time than Japanese forces required to dig defensive positions. Every island became an unsinkable aircraft carrier within days of capture. Traditional defensive strategies based on construction timelines were obsolete. The impact on Japanese strategic planning was catastrophic. The entire concept of the absolute national defense sphere, the defensive perimeter that was supposed to exhaust American forces through lengthy sieges, collapsed in the face of construction that proceeded faster than Japanese forces could relocate between threatened points. Admiral Soemu Toyoda admitted in post-war interrogations that Japanese defensive planning had never contemplated American construction speed. Japanese doctrine assumed that capturing an island meant gaining a defensive position that could be held for months while reinforcements arrived. The American ability to transform captured islands into offensive bases within 72 hours invalidated this entire strategic concept. The psychological impact on Japanese forces extended beyond strategic considerations to affect morale at every level. Letters home from soldiers, captured and translated by Allied intelligence, revealed growing despair. Private Shigeo Yamada wrote from Peleliu in September 1944 that Americans change the very earth. that mountains disappear overnight and swamps become airfields. Japanese forces prepared to defend for months, but Americans needed only days to establish overwhelming superiority. The sense of fighting an enemy that could reshape physical reality proved deeply demoralizing. At Peleliu in September 1944, Seabees faced their most difficult terrain yet. The island was coral limestone, riddled with caves, and covered in sharp coral formations that destroyed conventional equipment. Japanese artillery had pre-registered every potential construction site, yet, using armored bulldozers that continued working under fire and reef-blasting techniques that removed 35,000 cubic yards of coral in 48 hours, Seabees built a 6,000-foot bomber strip on terrain Japanese engineers had declared unbuildable. The construction proceeded while battles raged less than a mile away. When equipment operators were wounded, replacements took their positions without stopping the work. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.